Hello, everybody. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football podcast by Joel Haas of the Daily Collegian and our Penn State intern this fall. Joel, we're getting closer, just a couple of weeks now until we actually have some games to talk about. How are you?
I'm good. I think I'm just ready for football like everybody else. I've been watching old game replays on YouTube, things like that. I'm just ready for football to be here.
Today, we are going to be talking about potential freshman breakout candidates for Penn State. It's that time of year when, a lot of people are logging back in, hearing names that they haven't heard before, guys that, were in the recruiting class. And you might know that Penn State had a decent recruiting class, but you don't necessarily know a whole lot about the individuals themselves. So we're going to talk about some of those guys that are going to be joining the Nittany Lions, maybe getting into a little bit of other odds and ends with fall practice as well. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast, Voodoo Brewing in State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and their almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join them this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is their game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, but it is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, they have the Nittany Lions and college football on all day, and they finish things off Sunday with their weekly brunch paired with the Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. Check them out. All right, let's get into this, Joel. The first name that I had written down that I wanted to ask you about and what your read and vibe is Cooper Cousins. He was the offensive lineman who I think was really the freshman buzz of the spring. Has that carried over to fall practice, and what are your expectations for him this season?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're definitely right about that. I think he was a big name as soon as he stepped foot on campus. He was a key piece of the recruiting class. He was the first one to commit, got in very early, no fuss, anything like that. James Franklin said they went to commit, or they went to offer him and his family. Him and his family stepped around the corner of the building, made the decision, walked right back and committed on the spot right when they got the offer. There was, no mess, nothing like that. It was just a very simple commitment. Again, first one in the class, and he ended up being the highest rated recruit in Penn State's class. So obviously there were high expectations going in. But yeah, if you haven't been, super tapped in with Penn State recruiting this offseason, or you've kind of been zoned out, that's the name to know. If you're at the tailgate talking to your friends and you want to sound smart, that's the name to bring up as kind of a potential breakout player right there. I think he really could step in and start, which, starting as a true freshman at Penn State is always going to be difficult because it's always going to be a talented roster. There's always going to be these veterans who are also, highly rated recruits that you're going to have to beat out. But I think Cooper Cousins has a shot to do that. And it's even more impressive when you consider he's on the offensive line, which typically takes a few years of development. But he's, I think, 6'6", 320 pounds. So he's already got the size of practically an NFL offensive lineman coming in as just a true freshman in college. And yeah, I mean, the buzz has definitely been there for him. And we've heard some really great things. It sounds like the hype is building even more in the fall. We heard that he's staying out on the practice field for hours after practice. We heard from a few guys that, they were getting phone calls from Cooper Cousins at 11 p.m. at night, and he was asking them questions, about different schemes and pass sets, things like that, while he was at the practice field. And they were telling, dude, just go home, just go to sleep. Like, don't worry about it right now. James Franklin says he walks out of the Lash building around 9:45 at night, and he sees Cooper Cousins out on the field by himself, just working, getting reps in with his headphones on. So just really impressive stuff from a true freshman, showing that maturity already, definitely that drive to compete. When he first got to campus in the spring, Franklin said he would be focusing primarily at the center position, but then this fall we heard he's working at both center and guard, which kind of gives him a better chance to see the field this fall at one of those two positions. He's kind of got that versatility to play anywhere along the inside. And again, there are some talented players ahead of him on the depth chart. You look at Nick Dawkins, who's coming back for his 5th year. So it'd be pretty hard for Cooper Cousins as a true freshman to step in and kind of beat him out for that center role, but I wouldn't be surprised if he rotates in. Franklin mentioned this week that they were planning on playing, I think, at least 2 players at center and at least 3 players at guard. So you can kind of do the math there, and you can see that Cooper Cousins probably has a path to some snaps either at center or guard. And they do have some good depth at guard as well, with a lot of returning starters, guys like Vengayone, and then and Sal Wormley, guys like that and JB Nelson who've already gotten starts there in the past. So it'll be hard just because of that lack of experience for Cousins. But I think he definitely has the talent, definitely has the drive. Again, he's already got the size, so I feel like he's really kind of a plug and play, and he should find the field. If not week 1 against West Virginia, he'll probably be starting by the end of the year, I think.
Do you think it's, I guess, starting and playing those weighty downs, I guess, is my question. Because I think it's one thing to say, yeah, you're gonna get time on the offensive line when you're beating some of these teams. If you're Penn State, hopefully by double digits early in the season, you're getting late in games. The same way Drew Aller was able to get reps as a freshman. I think there's a difference between that and being the guy, in those weighty downs against Ohio State and in, the biggest game of the season. Do you think he has the potential to be that guy and not just a freshman that we see a lot of?
It's going to be tough, like I mentioned, just because of the guys that he has ahead of him. A lot of veterans who are kind of above him on the depth charts. It will be tough, especially at the beginning of the year. But I think by the end of the year, he could be a starter, and I would probably predict that. And then there's always the chance of injury, which obviously, you're never wishing for an injury or anything like that. But if something happens, and offensive line is a position where you're probably going to see some injuries throughout the year. So if anything happens to Dawkins or one of the guards, probably Cousins has a chance to step right into that role as most likely a second stringer, if not a starter.
Also wanted to ask you about Max Granville. He was one of the centerpieces of the 2025 recruiting class that was supposed to be signing, at the end of this year. But he instead reclassified to 2024 and is now kind of a centerpiece of that class. What's your read on him? I know it's just been a few weeks since all of that went down. Is that too short of a timeline to expect him to be able to come in here and make an impact, or would he not be making a decision like this unless the expectation was to, come in and play to some degree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a pretty surprising move when he decided to reclassify up to the 2024 class for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's always surprising when someone reclassifies just because of how rare that is. So that, they have to feel comfortable moving up and the staff has to feel comfortable moving him up and everything like that. But then also you look at the depth in the room, they, defensive end, they lose 2 starters, sure, but they have former 5-star Dennis-Sutton on one side and then Abdul Carter, who's coming down from linebacker on the other side. And, I don't think he has a chance of beating out either of those guys. They're both potential first-round picks. But as a depth piece, sure. I mean, with Nittany Lions recently being dismissed from the program, that kind of gives Granville a chance to bump up the depth chart a little bit. And what we saw at practice, he didn't look out of place. He didn't look confused. I mean, that's a guy who should be getting ready for his senior year of high school, but he looked, from a size-wise and just the way he was moving through drills and things like that, didn't look out of place at all. He looked like he had caught on really quickly, and that's kind of what we heard from Franklin as well. Franklin said he was impressed with how quickly Granville's been able to acclimate at Penn State and just kind of jump right in and join the group. So again, this year, I don't know how much action he sees, most likely just some garbage time snaps, if anything, but definitely just the move itself, him reclassifying upper class, kind of tells you everything you need to know about how much talent he has and how confident they are in his ability in the future.
Speaking of centerpieces of recruiting classes, you've also got Luke Reynolds generating some buzz. James Franklin bringing him up in his comments recently. Daniel Gallen of 247 Sports did a nice profile of him. Says the 5-star tight end bulked up over 20 pounds this offseason. I think it's going to be a similar theme to what we've been saying to this point, Joel, of Tyler Warren is obviously there as TE1. Khalil Dinkins is another guy that James Franklin was praising this week. He's more of a veteran guy. But Luke Reynolds has the pedigree. So what's your read on his ability to come in and make some noise?
Yeah, it's really it seems like that tight end room every year, they just bring in a highly rated guy, and you just kind of know that the Penn State tight end room is going to be good regardless of who's, playing in that room. We heard Kotonicki say time and time again that he plans on getting his best players on the field regardless of position. I think at one point he joked about having like 10 offensive linemen on the field if that was, the 10 best players on the offense. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how many tight ends they use. Obviously, they used a lot of 12 personnel last year with Theo and Tyler typically on the field together. So it'll be interesting to see this year. Obviously Reynolds comes in as a true freshman, so on the depth chart he's starting low, but has a chance to move up. But like you mentioned, there's a lot of traffic kind of in his way, guys ahead of him. Dinkins, Rappleyea is another guy up there. So he has his work cut out for him. But yeah, I mean, we've heard great things, and depending on which recruiting site you go by, he was either the top player in Penn State's class or one of the top players in the class. So yeah, definitely, really high expectations for him. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say he'll be the best tight end to come through Penn State in recent years, despite all the talent that's come through, just because of his rating and of what we've heard so far. But again, it'll just be interesting because Penn State, especially at tight end, likes to favor those veterans we've seen throughout the years. I mean, it was the same thing last year with Theo and Tyler getting the bulk of the reps as the oldest guys in the room, even with some talented younger guys. So it will be difficult. But again, if Kotelnicki plans on using 2, maybe even 3 tight ends on the field at the same time, I think that's where you might be able to see Reynolds kind of get on the field there.
Well, I think it's going to dovetail interestingly with my next question. We spend a lot of time talking about Penn State's deficiencies at receiver last season, and will those guys be better? I think part of that equation is also, do any of these guys that are coming in, Tyseer Denmark, Josiah Brown, I think Peter Gonzalez was on that list until his injury that reportedly is going to keep him out longer term. But do you look at any of those guys and say we might be overlooking them in talking all the time about some of these other names that have been with the program for a couple of years in terms of how that receiver room is going to come together?
But yeah, with the wide receiver room, I mean, like you mentioned, Peter Gonzalez is a guy who sustained a long-term injury, Franklin said. We don't know the exact timeline for that, but he should probably be out for most of the season, if not the entire season. But a guy like Tyseer Denmark, I think, is someone who could step in and be a contributor. Not necessarily a starter. I think that'd be pretty difficult as a true freshman, but he could definitely see the field this year. We've heard good things from him, from Franklin, from some of the other wide receivers, even some of the defensive backs have said that he's been stepping up and doing a good job so far. 4-star recruit, so a guy that comes in with pretty big expectations. And I think a lot of people are turning to, maybe some of the returning pieces, Harrison Wallace, Amari Evans, or the transfers like Julian Fleming. But not a lot of people are giving love to the freshmen who could potentially make an impact this year. And I think if one of those wide receivers is going to step up and really push for playing time, I think it's going to be Tyseer Denmark.
Yeah, it's not unprecedented in Penn State history. You remember Derek Williams, Deion Butler, those guys, Jordan Norwood coming in and making a lot of noise. I think that's a high bar to hold any of these freshmen to, but it does happen, and they come from off the board, or in some cases. I think Derek Williams was pretty well on the board and make a difference. So, hopefully that's providing some competition for some of the guys in that room to up the intensity a little bit. Speaking of receivers, there was a lot of praise for Liam Clifford and Trey Wallace from James Franklin this week. What did you make of him highlighting those two specifically? Because they're just two of the names that we talk about in this conversation all the time. You mentioned Amari Evans earlier. There are some other guys. So what was your reaction to, James Franklin narrowing the focus on those guys?
Yeah, that was interesting. I think the Harrison Wallace praise was something that we've kind of been hearing throughout the summer and even, last year, as just a guy that consistently has earned praise from Franklin despite not really being able to stay on the field due to injuries and things like that. But Franklin's always been consistent with, saying that he's one of the top receivers. I think he'll probably be Penn State's wide receiver 1 this season in terms of catches and yards. I think Julian Fleming's another guy who'll be in that conversation. But the Liam Clifford one, it was kind of the first time we've really heard Franklin talk about Clifford like that. And I think a lot of people just think of Clifford as, Sean's brother, as the guy who's kind of came to the team because of Sean, but not necessarily a contributor. And I think that narrative needs to change because I think he really is capable of potentially starting in the slot this year. I believe it's between him and Caden Saunders. But regardless, both of them will probably get a lot of time. And I think he really could be a contributor. I think he had about 230 yards last season, something like that. I think he could potentially double that this season. I really think, I don't think he's going to be some breakout star or anything like that, but I think he is, a serviceable wide receiver that can really contribute to the team. Good hands, good route running, things like that. Worried about the fundamentals. And then we also heard that he was kind of developing as a vocal leader, which is something that, his brother Sean was known for during his time here. I actually asked Julian Fleming, if anyone was kind of stepping up as a vocal leader within the unit. He named Liam Clifford, and then Liam Clifford, I asked the same question, and he named Julian Fleming. So it was kind of funny that they picked each other. But Yeah, I mean, we've heard good stuff from Liam about his ability to step up. Again, not sure if he starts in that slot position. I think it'll be between him and Saunders, but I do think he will be a contributor this year, and he's more than just the brother of Sean Clifford. I think he will be a contributor this year.
Oh, and doubling that production is not insignificant. If you look down that Penn State stats list from last season, 200 yards was a big deal. So if you can go from 2 to 4, that would be a really big deal, I think, for this passing game to have some level of reliable target there, even if he's not going to be the leading receiver. Joel, another thing James Franklin brought up that I found interesting was that the third running back spot is still up for grabs because of some what he called bumps and bruises. That ended up being an important role last season with Trey Potts. I think, at times when Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen were struggling a little bit, he could come in late in games, give you a spark, sometimes in the middle of games. And I think that mattered. I think of the Northwestern game specifically that he played well in. So it's not a, insignificant role, even though you think of those two top running backs. Who do you think they wish will be able to step up for that job in the real world? If injuries weren't necessarily part of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few guys vying for that position, and we kind of saw in the spring game a few different running backs get a chance there. But I really think Quinton Martin is the guy that they're counting on. I feel like that's kind of the guy that they're leaning toward, even if they don't want to admit it right now, just because he would be jumping a few sophomores or redshirt freshmen, and you kind of don't want to announce that publicly, because then you have to worry about the whole transfer situation and things like that anytime a younger guy is jumping the older guys. But Quinton Martin, as a true freshman, has come in. He's impressed, looked good in the spring game. And I think he's really making a push. He was one of the higher rated recruits in Penn State's class, and I think he has the highest ceiling out of the group. So I think if anyone's going to be able to emerge into that running back 3 spot, I think Quinton Martin's going to be that guy. I think he's kind of the future of the room if Singleton and Kaytron are both heading off to the NFL either this year or next year.
Do you think he could be a threat to either one of those guys if they struggle for maybe some number 2 reps?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think just given what we've seen from Singleton and Allen through the first 2 years, even last year you could call it a down year, but they both had like over 800 rushing yards. So, even in a quote unquote down year, we saw that they were still pretty productive overall. And so I think they would have to take even another step down from where they were last year. And I just don't see that happening. It is an interesting question. If that does happen, if one of them does, regress even further than what we saw last year, then yeah, potentially I could see Martin. And again, that kind of depends on his development as well. I could see him stepping in as kind of that RB2. But it would be hard to see right now, just based on what we've seen from Kaytron and Nick. I think they've kind of set the floor of what they can be, and I don't think they're going, lower than that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I just think it's an interesting question to ponder because of how last season went. Got a couple more odds and ends here before we log off. First, wanted to get to this $25 million donation toward the stadium upgrade. It's one of the biggest donations in Penn State history, maybe short of Terry Pagula and the hockey, donation. And it's going to the stadium at a time, getting back to our conversation last week, Joel, when we talked about Penn State's pretty flush with cash as an athletic department. And most of this project is going to be funded through the athletic department. All the while, Penn State's getting lapped by schools like Ohio State in NIL. Do you look at this as a misplaced priority for the donor base to be, I don't want to say Penn State's ever going to turn down money for something that, especially as expensive as a stadium upgrade, but, it's going to be a long time before Beaver Stadium is fully renovated in that way. And in the interim, you're trying to compete for playoff spots. You're trying to compete, to get over that hump and be one of those final 4, one of those final 2, one of those final 1 teams that you haven't been for most of the past decade. I'll just ask the question again. Is it a misplaced priority? Because I tend to feel like that money could have done a lot more good a lot sooner in the hands of the NIL collectives.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I don't know if there's necessarily a right answer to that, but I think the way that Penn State's looking at it is, the stadium hasn't had a major renovation since before I was born. And so I think that's kind of long overdue. and they're kind of prioritizing that before they get into NIL. And then maybe once the stadium's been renovated, they can kind of funnel more money toward NIL. And maybe by then we'll have some new legislation about, collectives and being able to pay players directly, and maybe some kind of cap on how much players can make and things like that in the future. But for now, it seems like Penn State, both the program and the fans and the donors, are trying to kind of prioritize the stadium more than NIL right now. Which again, I think the stadium renovations are long overdue, and if you can kind of get that out of the way over the next few years, then you can kind of turn your focus to NIL and try and get more recruits in. But yeah, I mean, I feel like the NIL is taking a hit in part due to the stadium, and I got to sit in on that board of trustees meeting, kind of listen to them talk about the funding, where they were going to get the funding, and I believe as part of the proposal for the $700 million renovations, they were saying they anticipated that they could raise half of it through donors. So basically what they were saying was, we don't have the 700 million right now. We have about half of that, but we anticipate that once we announce the renovation, we can get the other half through donations. So I think they're expecting about 350 million through donations, which obviously that's a whole lot of money. 25 million is going to take a decent chunk of that, but you're still going to need a lot more. But again, yeah, I think the stadium should be Penn State's priority if it were up to me, just because, again, it hasn't been renovated in a very long time. NIL, will always be there. You might kind of take a short-term hit in terms of how much you're able to pay the players now, but once you get the stadium fixed up, that even alone can help with recruiting, just having recruits come in on visits and seeing the stadium and how nice it looks and the big welcome center that they're adding, and that can help with recruiting for other sports as well, because even basketball, baseball, whatever, when they're recruiting, they like to take the recruits to see Beaver Stadium and kind of experience the Penn State fan experience. And so I think it will actually help in recruiting overall, the stadium renovation. And then once you get that out of the way, you can kind of focus more on NIL. We did get an interesting number. Mike Porman with statecollege.com actually published an article where he said Drew Aller made about $800,000 a year in NIL, which I haven't heard that before. I haven't seen that published before. So I think that's new information. I thought that was kind of interesting. Just short of $1 million for Aller, which is honestly higher than what I would have expected. But again, short of what we're hearing for some of the other quarterbacks in the country who are making millions of dollars.
Just to play devil's advocate, though, Joel, I mean, can't you expect more money from donors if you're winning big games and playing on big stages and getting into those spots and generating an excitement with the program that, I think is lacking and is evident in the NIL donations to this point. I get it with the stadium, and I trust me, I've sat in those stands plenty enough to know that there's a lot of rough edges that need to be rounded out, but I also was at Ohio Stadium this year. I mean, it's not exactly, the gleaming jewel of Ohio or anything. It's pretty much what it's always been. I haven't been to the Big House in a minute, but it's always kind of been, just a big stadium and not like, Kennywood for recruits. The stadium. I even think of the Rose Bowl. The Rose Bowl is in a beautiful place, but the stadium itself is just kind of a building. And if you drop to the Rose Bowl in the middle of Pennsylvania, it'd just kind of be a thing. Do you think the priority? So when I say misplaced priorities, I certainly think the stadium should be one. I just wonder if you would get more money for a project like that if you can prove to people that you can take the next step with this giant investment you're asking them to make.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're thinking prioritize recruiting, get better recruits with NIL, and then after you're winning, you get more money for the stadium. Is that kind of your standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's a proof of concept situation as opposed to saying, because listen, I mean, we live in Pittsburgh. The taxpayers built PNC Park with the same promises, right? And they've had 4 winning seasons since the place opened in 2001. So, I just wonder if it's a misplaced priority. Not that it doesn't belong on the list of priorities, high on the list of priorities, but isn't this ultimately about winning?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could make like a chicken or the egg kind of argument there where, if Penn State does win bigger games, they might be able to get some more money out of the donors. But at the same time, maybe, losing in those bigger games might be more appealing to people. People might feel, I would say, on the other hand, less inclined to donate if, say, hypothetically, Penn State were to win a national championship. Not that I think that's going to happen, but people might look at that and say, well, if they can, do all that with the current NIL situation, what's the point of me donating? And you look at a team like Ohio State that is probably number 1 or 2 in the country in terms of its NIL, just lost to Michigan for the 3rd straight year, and then Michigan wins a national championship. And I think part of the reason for the NIL success is the fans saw what Michigan was able to do, and they kind of want that for themselves, that they want to get, a national championship, bring a national championship to Columbus. So I almost think the losses can work in the same kind of way to motivate people to donate. But yeah, it'll be interesting to kind of see if wins would help with NIL.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point about Ohio State. But why is that not the same situation here? Why do Penn State fans not have the same reaction to losing to Ohio State and Michigan every year? Why is that not the bar? And I even think about what built this Michigan run. It was some questionable stuff that Jim Harbaugh has since been penalized for, but they were unapologetic about it this past season, Joel. I mean, the fan base, the coaches, everyone, they understood that college football is about going and taking the crown and asking questions later. That's what Michigan did. I don't think anyone's giving that national championship up or any of those wins against Ohio State. Why does the lack of success not bother Penn State fans to a similar degree the way it does in Columbus?
I mean, you could say that part of it is just the expectations are higher in Ohio State. They want to compete for national championships every year, whereas Penn State, again, a history of success.
Penn State just says they want to, but they don't actually want to. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, I guess if you wanted to kind of simplify it, I think that's part of it. I think the Penn State fan base is just a very kind of old school group where they don't really believe in the pay for play. You know what I mean? I think they've never really been a school that pays its players, legal or not. I think it's funny because I see like accusations of Penn State where, before NIL was a thing about them paying players. And I'm thinking like they can't even pay players in the NIL era. I don't think they were doing it before the NIL era. But I think it really is just kind of a success with honor. It should be about getting an education. Joe Paterno's the grand experiment or whatever he called it, I think it's always been at Penn State just more about you should be coming here to get your education. You play football and that's great, but you shouldn't be worried about, getting paid or anything like that.
That here's the thing, Joel. I don't want to hear the rants about James Franklin. I don't. The man has his flaws, and we've talked about them on this show with Seth last year, and I'm sure we'll talk about them at points this season. But they've invested $100 million in him. He's not going anywhere because you've committed all that resource to that guy, and I just don't want to hear it. If people are not willing to pony up and do the things that you have to do in this era of college football, you can't throw it all on the feet of the coach. And that's kind of where my head is going into the season. I'm excited for this season, but I absolutely do not want to be hearing about James Franklin and man, he's fallen short. So let's buy him out for $80 million and go out and find someone who has not proven he can win at that level. I don't want to hear it until people start writing the checks to let him compete at the level that people say they want to see Penn State compete. Then they just got to be willing to say that maybe you top out at a top 8 to 12 program. Because that seems to be the attitude around Happy Valley. And I think there needs to be some more, shared burden. And listen, I'm not talking about the fan in WH. Like, I'm talking about the big money donors, the car dealership owners, those guys who have the coin to throw around and are relying on this success with honor narrative to justify not doing it. When they lose their third game and don't make the playoff, those are the guys I'm going to be looking at first. I want to get you out of here on this, Joel. That was a little intense. Let's have a little more fun. The AP poll, Penn State came in at number 8 this week, ahead of Michigan, unlike the coaches poll. I wanted to ask you which teams you think ranked behind them are going to be most dangerous for them potentially making this first 12-team playoff. You have Michigan at number 9, Florida State at 10, Missouri at 11, Utah at 12, LSU at 13, Clemson at 14, Tennessee at 15, Oklahoma at 16. Then I think it goes Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Miami, Texas A&M, Arizona, Kansas, USC, North Carolina State, and Iowa. Anyone on that list that you're looking at as maybe a top 10 team that is not getting that hype right now?
Well, yeah. So immediately Utah stands out to me, and that's only because they play in the Big 12, because someone from that conference is going to get an auto bid regardless of how you feel about that conference. Even if, none of those teams are really kind of top 12 material. someone from that conference has to get in. Utah right now, I think, is the betting favorite to win the Big 12, or tied as the betting favorite. And so, I mean, that kind of scares you, because they're just going to or whether it's Utah, whether it's Oklahoma State, whether it's Kansas State, somebody's going to get the auto bid from that. And even if they're, a worse team on paper than Penn State, they might get in and push Penn State down a spot. And then just some of those SEC schools can always be dangerous. We know what the recruiting's like, everything like that. And we've kind of seen how those teams can kind of jump up year to year, whether it's LSU having a big year, Tennessee having a big year, because there's going to be the traditional Alabama, Georgia powerhouses at the top. But then there's always schools, Missouri's another one, that could jump up and have a big year, 10-2, 11-1. And Missouri actually this year, I think, has a really easy schedule, at least as far as SEC schedules go. I think they missed like 3 of the top 4 teams in the conference. And so I think they have a good shot of making it, just based on kind of their record, the way they play, even if they're not necessarily a top 12 school. I think an SEC school that, goes 11-1, 10-2 is just going to make it in regardless. So I think some of those SEC schools, and then, like I mentioned, someone from the Big 12, maybe Utah.
Going to be fun to monitor. Joel, I think we're a little over time here. Thanks for stopping by. And we'll be back next week. We're getting a little closer to being able to talk about actual football games. Penn State, West Virginia, August 31st. That's the season opener. So it's getting closer, folks, just a little bit longer. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We're going to have a lot more about the Steelers this week, monitoring the Brandon Ayuk trade or not. And then also Steelers-Bills joint practices on the south side ahead of the preseason game at Acrisure Stadium on Saturday. So a lot more coming your way. Make sure you're signed up for the ride. And we will talk to you again in this same space next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.